welcome back, everybody. So now we're moving on to our second panel that will discuss designing peace-building projects that utilize technology. And the panel is chaired by Rachel Brown, founder and CEO of Sisi and Amani. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. So we have a really exciting panel today. I'm going to talk quickly so all of our panelists can have more time to talk. They've done a lot of really interesting work on various projects, and what they're going to focus on today is specifically the design process for different projects that they've worked on, examples of processes and pieces of design processes that have worked well, that have not worked so well, and some general learnings. Again, probably we don't have that much time for questions at the end. This is my personal email address. If you have questions, please email them to me. We have a working group tomorrow, and we'll integrate your questions into that working group. Our first panelist today is Stephen Wunker. He is the managing director of an innovation and design firm called New Markets Advisors, and they are working on applying design thinking to the peace-building world. So here you go, Stephen.
Great, thank you. So very quickly about who we are and why we're here. New Markets is a private sector firm. We do work with a very broad range of principally private sector entities, from Siemens to Nike and many others in between, looking at how new markets can be created, and in particular how we can apply the theories of disruptive innovation that were created by my mentor, Clayton Christensen, down the river at Harvard Business School, to specific design or business challenges. And increasingly, we started looking at how we can do that in the public sector as well. We do that by both taking that academic thinking and then applying some strategy consulting skills as well as entrepreneurial skills that we have in-house to particular challenges to create a more holistic and well-rounded implementation plan than you would typically find at some of the pure play consulting firms. So what I want to do is talk to you about patterns of innovation, and in particular, how sustaining and disruptive innovations are distinct and what that might mean for the peace-building community. And I'm going to start by talking about an institution that is right down the road, but which you probably didn't expect to hear about today, which is Massachusetts General Hospital. Now, MGH was founded in 1811, and if you were ill in 1811, you really only had one place to go if you wanted to have a decent hope of being treated competently. MGH was the only show in town, and in an era of very few general hospitals to begin with, it was really a beacon for the overall United States on what a general hospital could be. Over the years, it developed more and more competencies, it developed specialties, and it got more and more proud of the advanced procedures that could be done in its confines. In fact, it got so good at what it was doing that the ordinary run-of-the-mill procedures or primary care wasn't really the sort of thing that interested it anymore. And you start to have the advent of secondary or community hospitals that were located closer to where people lived and worked, and were able to do those run-of-the-mill things with complete competency, while leaving MGH to focus on the most complex, most prestigious sort of cases. Now, fast forward a century almost, and you can look at what's happened in the past decade, where medical care isn't just delivered in hospitals, nor even in physicians' offices, but even in retail clinics, like MinuteClinic, which you can find in a CVS pharmacy. Walgreens and other pharmacies have analogous sorts of services. Now, the MinuteClinic service, it has a nurse, a qualified nurse, a nurse practitioner, doing very standardized diagnoses and prescriptions for run-of-the-mill ailments such as ear infections or sinusitis. And that is enabled by certain technologies, particularly rapid diagnostic tests and the chemistry within them, as well as healthcare IT, which allows a very algorithmic protocol to be given to that nurse such that she doesn't have to exercise a whole lot of medical judgment. Technology has been the enabler of that decentralization of care. And you see, even more recently, the advent of home monitoring technologies like the Health Buddy above, which brings medicine right to a person's bedside in their own home. Technology itself did not create these new models. Healthcare IT is abundantly present at Massachusetts General, as it is in each of these other settings. But it has enabled other sorts of commercialization models to be layered on top of that and decentralize access to medical care. And you see the same thing in computing. Mainframe computing used to be, you would have to stack of punch cards, you would bring it to a centralized mainframe, you would have to wait overnight for the punch cards to be run, and you got an answer back. And now we have PCs not only on the desktop, but what's equivalent to a PC in our pockets with our smartphone. So technology in that instance enabled not just faster computing, but greater access to computing. And that's often a pattern that we see in innovation as well. It's not just the technological advancements, but it's deploying that advancements for the decentralization of services in such a way that they are more accessible, they are simpler to consume, and oftentimes they are radically less expensive than at the center of the circle. That doesn't mean that the center of the circle goes away. Massachusetts General is a thriving institution, and it's building a new edition as we speak. But it is fundamentally uninterested in those outer circles of care. Even though it might have had all the money in the world and the competencies to do them, it didn't prioritize those competencies, and it didn't have the incentives to pursue that sort of decentralization. Now, we believe that same dynamic that applies again and again and again in the private sector also pertains to the world of peacebuilding. The NGOs in the center have all the capabilities in the world, here I'm talking about the big international NGOs, to enable people at the periphery to consume new technological tools. But it isn't necessarily what gets prioritized. That's not the $5 or $10 million that the big donors are going to be financing. It's not the things that people get promoted for internally, nor recognized for internally. And so, broadly speaking, it doesn't happen. Now, Clay Christensen's frameworks of disruptive and sustaining innovation come into play here. We can think about, broadly, two types of innovation. One is sustaining innovation, which sustains existing approaches along well-accepted measures of performance. And it basically improves on what already exists. So crisis mapping, for instance, in Iraq, would be an instance of sustaining innovation. It helps the large NGOs map what's currently happening that are relevant to their existing programs. Crisis mapping is perhaps not that pertinent to somebody who's actually living in the midst of the crisis that doesn't need a map of what is going on. SMS polling in Yemen is another example. A wonderful way to get data in a very decentralized manner. So again, nothing knocking that, it's very important, but it helps those central institutions do what they have always done a little bit better, a little bit more cost effectively, but it doesn't radically decentralize the provision of peacebuilding services. By contrast, you can think about disruptive innovation, which disrupts the status quo, hence the name, by creating new dimensions of performance. Usually, we will find new processes, interactions, or partners. Very frequently, these are enabled by new technology, but again, it is not technology in itself. So in this world, Ushahidi is probably the example par excellence of disruptive innovation. A venture that we've been involved with called Yowzit, which is sort of a Yelp for Africa based in Johannesburg, is this sort of approach in the world of governance. And a shout out to our partners at AID who have actually recently given Yowzit a small grant to pursue this. So rather than having people just rate restaurants and beauty shops and other sorts of institutions that they use in the private sector, Yowzit brings ratings and reviews to the public sector. So people can review their own police station or their clinic, for instance. So it decentralizes those tools. Certainly, the large NGOs interested in governance could have done this, but they didn't, because it isn't the sort of thing that gets prioritized. Now, CellPay is a company that I used to run, which was the first mobile commerce company in Africa, run by what is now Airtel. And CellPay is an example of a disruptive innovation enabled by technology, in this case, mobile money. But it's also an example of how certain things can be deployed both for disruptive and sustaining ends. So I won't go into the business model for CellPay, but it was a disruptive innovation creating new forms of consumption and decentralization of services. Whereas if you look at the example of mobile money being used in Afghanistan to pay police salaries, highly commendable, but it does existing things along existing measures of performance. It just does them somewhat better. So to get disruptive innovations to take root, we need to deploy design thinking, topic of this panel, and 3 general precepts of design thinking that we like to use. They truly need to be user-centered. Now, everybody talks about being user-centered, but it is remarkable when you look at the needs assessments that get done, how institution-centric they tend to be. User-centered means really going out and seeing things from people's points of view, and that is time-consuming and it's cumbersome, but it is extraordinarily powerful. You have to have lots of right ideas. The predisposition for big institutions is quickly to focus on one key idea, because that's what people like to discuss in decision-making meetings. It moves up the ranks with a fair degree of efficiency. But design thinking doesn't work that way. You need to let a lot of flowers bloom, and only over time, as you get real feedback from real users, winnow down those concepts. And finally, you need to rapidly prototype, which means that you need to frequently iterate. Not imagine that you're going out with the Lexus, but build the bicycle first, and learn as you go along how to improve that service in such a way that ultimately you can get to that perfected end state that you may aspire to, but which simply isn't realistic if you don't know what direction that end state is pointing in. So there are a lot of questions and challenges. Here are 3. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go over them. But clearly, we think design thinking, disruptive innovation, has a big role to play in peace building. It's one reason we sponsor this conference. We're enthusiastic about what we see as a big growth field. Thanks.
Thank you. So our next panelist, we're going to jump right to him, is Jim Williams. He's the founder of Raabta, which is a technology and communications company in Pakistan.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello. Hi. Hey. I'm Jim. As Rachel says, I run a research-driven tech and communications company in Islamabad. Doesn't it sound snazzy? The only problem with that is that when we started 3 years ago, we didn't think of ourselves as a research-driven tech and communications company. We sort of thought of ourselves as those mobile phone guys. You know, those guys who are really excited about mobile phones in Pakistan, how everyone's getting loads of mobile phones. And wouldn't it be great if we could find ways of using mobile phones to solve peace-building problems? So we ran around Pakistan finding conflicts and then throwing mobile phones at them. And obviously, it went pretty badly wrong. So I don't often talk about that. It's kind of embarrassing. But hopefully, you can all be my confidants with it. So what did we do wrong? Let me give you an example of a project. This isn't actually a peace-building one, but I think you'll get the message quite clearly from it. It was a humanitarian project. A little bit like those fail-fare presentations that sometimes you see where, all the way along it sounds like it's going to be a failure. Then at the very end, they talk about how, in fact, they rescued it and it was really successful. This is one of these stories, but I actually want to focus on the failure bit. So what happened is that we had a donor who wanted us to use SMS to enable humanitarian beneficiaries to give feedback, to say, thank you very much for that tent, but we could actually really do with some food. Or I had to pay a bribe to be able to get that food crate. Or actually, just thank you, that was great. That was exactly what we needed. Tiny project, 10 villages. And my business partner, he went down there, and we decided to do some basic sort of due diligence. First check, did everybody have phones? Yes, it's fine. People have got phones, or they've got reliable access to phones. However, no one could read or write. So this was an SMS project. No one could read or write. Right. Went back to the donor and said, is there anything we can do about this? Can we make it more voice-based? And the money was assigned based on SMS. So in the end, it was fine. My business partner figured it out, and he worked out that you could use the numbers on the mobile phone. OK, people couldn't read or write, but they know the numbers 0 to 9. So he predefined 10 types of feedback and complaint that people could give about humanitarian aid. And in the end, we rescued the project. But only really by the skin of our teeth. It nearly went really badly wrong. And we learned from that kind of thing that you can't be technology-driven. It doesn't matter how exciting it is, how much potential. I think supposedly on Monday, we finally got the 3G auctions in Pakistan. And there's going to be so much money from the donors about, great, what can we do with apps? Let's start throwing apps at problems. And it doesn't work. It really doesn't work. Now, throw into this the context of violent conflict. Violent conflict is not only more complicated and fast-changing, it also has much higher stakes. If you do your projects wrong, you can make conflicts worse. I mean, who knows whether you're actually going to lead to people dying, but maybe you're increasing the risks of that happening. And it's really, really easy to get it wrong. So, you know, a second horror story. I do quite a lot of work with the Pakistani media. I work with non-English language TV channels, newspapers, and I work with them to understand how they conceive of and report on and frame political violence. So what always happens, you walk into one of these TV stations, they've never met you before, you're this white British guy, and you know, you've turned up, and you start talking about political violence. And odds on, 80-20, pretty much, they interrupt you and say, look, we've got it under control, it's fine, don't worry. And what they assume you're talking about is sectarian violence, which is a very big problem in Pakistan, specifically Sunni against Shia, and also Muslim against non-Muslim. And what they say to you is, don't worry about it, we don't report on sectarian violence. It's fine. So, you know, there's nothing to talk about. And if they do report on it, what they say is, don't worry, we never identify the aggressors or the victims as being Sunni or Shia. We just say, you know, members of two groups. It's fine. Now, the thinking there is that sectarian violence is community on community. Neighbors attacking one another in villages, in towns. And so the thinking is, if we identify that the victims were Shia, then maybe we will have a Shia backlash against the Sunnis. So we should not say anything. But in fact, that's what the dynamic of sectarian conflict was like in Pakistan 3 years ago. Now it's not community on community, it's organized terrorist groups against civilians. So you have organized groups attacking ordinary people, and the media's response to it loses the opportunity to be able to tackle that conflict because they're not drawing any attention to the nature of the conflict, they're sweeping it under the carpet. And when you're doing peacebuilding design, you can actually do exactly the same thing by getting your analysis wrong and by making assumptions that what it was like 3 years ago is also what it's like now. So throw these two problems together, the problem of picking the right technology and understanding the conflict, and the whole endeavor of technology-enabled peacebuilding design becomes an absolute minefield. There are many ways in which it can go wrong. So what we're going to do tomorrow in the working group session is start to create some kinds of guidelines for being able to navigate these kinds of minefields, how not to get things wrong. There are very big challenges, like how to work in an industry where the donor money is actually pushing often in the opposite direction. Not all the time, there's some really wonderful exceptions, but quite a lot towards the technology being exciting rather than the problems that need to be solved. How do you do this when you can't actually really take the time to design your projects until you've already been paid to do them? So you have to design your activities and your proposals, but you haven't had the time to be able to do the research, and you're already committed to these activities. There are very, very serious problems. So I'm looking forward to the conversation tomorrow. I've got a bunch of ideas how we do this internally in Raabta. I call it brutal analysis method, and my staff don't really like me for it. But things like, okay, so you're doing a project about building the idea of peace, the value of peace. Okay, so who's your audience? Let's say your audience is people who are victims of violence. They're socially excluded. How exactly does getting the people who are most affected by violence and least able to change their situation to want peace more actually help generate peace? So we go through a process of working out, we call it a materiality assessment. The people that we are actually working with, the different stakeholders in our projects, how far are they actually able to do anything with what we're doing? If we make a map that shows the violence that's going on in a certain part of Pakistan, who's looking at it and how do they have any kind of power to change things? And making sure that you build that full sort of spectrum through into your design of your projects is absolutely critical. So I won't go into details now, but we'll talk about it tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Next, we have Ben Rempell. He is the Deputy Country Representative for USAID Office of Transitions Program in Honduras.
Thank you. I hope that wasn't our donor, our project that was giving you that.
OTI is one of the wonderful exceptions.
It might have been, and if it was, I apologize. But we've obviously made some mistakes in the past. But, I'm going to talk about, it's great to be up here with this great group of people. It's often the folks that are up here when OTI enters a new country that we immediately look to try to really understand the terrain and take leadership from. So it's great to be able to meet everybody here. I'm going to talk a little bit about a specific case where OTI in Honduras is using very basic mapping tools, mapping technology to overlay with more traditional forms of confidence building programs to try to reduce crime in Honduras. We often talk about, or just recently a colleague termed it, we're going from no tech to low tech. So this is not going to be a very high-tech, innovative type of idea that introduces some amazing new idea. These are things that have been done in the past, and we're just trying to apply what we feel works in the Honduras case. So basic background on OTI, like most of you out here, OTI is operating in very complex environments where cause and effect is rarely predictive, and we have to employ an action research methodology of constantly assessing what we are doing while acting and adapting what we do to act in a more effective way. So learning by doing, that's what we're constantly working on with every OTI program, and that's reflected through examples like that where if the idea was bad and we're told that the idea is bad, we actually have the mechanisms in place to say, well, sorry, we can actually change that, and we'll change the grant, we'll change the idea to reflect the realities. The realities and the context that we're trying to change in Honduras is about violent crime and trying to reduce rates of homicide and violent crime in Honduras. A little bit about the actual context. It is the country with the highest national homicide rate in the world. And two of its main cities, San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa, are in the top 5 over the last several years, year in and year out, about homicide rates. The national homicide rate is about 79 per 100,000 citizens. Some of the reasons behind that: heavy cocaine drug flows from South America into the consumer of North America, and it passes through Honduras, which causes a lot of disruption and has empowered and brought a lot of resources to transnational gangs who have taken over control of a lot of the country, particularly in the urban areas, as well as the northern coast where a lot of the drugs are trafficked through. The confidence in the security sector is very bad. The perception surveys vary, but it's always incredibly high in a lack of confidence in the police and other actors in the security sector to be able to do anything, and a lot of perceptions and some evidence as well that the security sector is involved in a lot of the crime themselves. And then at the community level, significant amounts of fear, no snitching, communities that are hit by some of this crime really are afraid to speak out because they're being monitored constantly. On the technological side, we did a consumption survey in the neighborhoods where we're working in Tegucigalpa, San Pedro Sula, and La Ceiba, and it was under 3% of the population that actually used the internet for consuming media and other forms of information. So very low connectivity based on cost, and a low capacity overall for technologically driven solutions. So we are trying to reduce homicides, other violent crime, by bringing citizens and government institutions together to be able to work more collaboratively, recognizing the low confidence in the government, particularly the security sector. We're trying to implement short-term, small grant activities to try to slowly build up that confidence in targeted communities where the violence has been most felt, most hardly felt. And through this, when we first started, a lot of what we were doing were recuperation of public spaces, trying to do basic training for police and community policing principles, but what we realized we really needed to do was to really drill down into these neighborhoods where we were working to identify where the hardest hit areas were, and then try to figure out what we could learn from that and how that could contribute to our program design. So we applied something that had been done by one of our programs in Haiti, where they were using OpenStreetMaps post-earthquake to organize youth, train them in OpenStreetMaps, and then they were going out and filling in empty spaces in OpenStreetMaps that could be used for the donor community, international humanitarian organizations to be able to go in and better understand what was going on from afar and respond with assistance. So we thought, let's try that in some of the communities and with some of the partners that we've been working with. So we organized, we didn't really know what was gonna come out of it, but we thought it was worth trying it out. And one thing that came out immediately was that the community groups that we were working with, where we had built up a level of trust, but we didn't think that we had built up enough trust for them to really share information about insecurity to the level that they did, really opened up and shared. I think it was them seeing their neighborhood in sort of a blank space on the wall, opening up Google Earth, that really got them to sort of talk and share, and starting with just these are parks that are not used, these are clinics that are closed, this is a police station that where there are never any police at, to this gang controls this neighborhood, that gang controls that neighborhood, this street, there's no lighting, and it's always where the drugs are being sold, or here is where there is a torture house. I mean, some very emotional things that people were sharing. So we immediately had to shift course, not use OpenStreetMaps because of the sensitivity of the information that people were sharing, and started using Google Earth so that it wouldn't be published out to everybody that these people were sharing this type of information. As we were able to build up trust both with the community groups as well as some police in the area, we introduced parallel sessions with police officers that were vetted and that we knew were trusted and had the potential to build up a level of trust in the community. And as we developed more and more better relationships with community leaders, we became more selective in sort of who was coming into these meetings, really wanting to make sure that they were safe spaces for people to open up and share information. So this is some of the output that came out from Google Earth, and we translated it into some maps that we would then use for program design, where we were able to identify where the gangs were controlling areas, where the frontier areas were that were most hard hit, and also able over time to visualize some change in gang control. And there's gonna be more talk about monitoring and evaluation later, but we're able to use these visuals for that. And then what we were able to do was really micro-target of interventions. So taking areas where both police and communities identified as these are the most dangerous areas in our neighborhood, we would then organize events where the community leaders would go out and have an event at night, or they would demand that the electricity company come and put lights in the street. And then they would also call up the police and say, hey, could you provide security on this day to this area where we're gonna be out there doing this stuff, because normally we don't go out there. And that slowly builds that confidence between communities and the government institutions that they can be responsive if we ask them to. So the program is ongoing. We're still doing these. The confidence building, the IT solution, the mapping isn't the confidence building activity that on its own. We do these in separate sessions. They're not sitting there together sharing this information. It's just used to be able to take the information that they're both giving us to organize events where they can then in the real world, interact and build up confidence. On the community policing front, we have been working with them to introduce mapping to be more effective police officers. But what we think is it's going to be even more low-tech than that. It'll probably just be a map on a wall with some thumbtacks. So the tech is very, very low, and that's what we're trying to find is low-tech solutions that people will actually use moving forward. And then, one of the questions that gets brought up a lot is the information security issue. And as people are sharing sensitive information, being very important and working very hard to ensure that their names and their identities are kept confident, and if they don't feel like they want their information to be out there, we don't put it out there. So then it's not used. So that's just an ethical dilemma I think that we're all challenging. That's it. Thank you.
Great. So our last panelist is Audrey Blachen. She is the Deputy Chief of Party for the USAID-funded program Viable Support to Transition and Stability in South Sudan, and she works for AECOM.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to everybody who pulled all of this together, the organizers, the sponsors, the volunteers, and the participants. I think this is a really exciting event. I'm very happy to participate, and I'm hoping that I can contribute in hopefully something that is maybe a slightly more pragmatic and practical approach than sophisticated or technical, based on some of the experiences that we've had in the past couple of years in South Sudan. Our program, which was known as the South Sudan and Transition and Conflict Mitigation Program up until we had the recent name change, is a USAID program managed out of South Sudan through the Office of Transition and Conflict Mitigation by a company called AECOM, as Rachel mentioned. Similar to the OTI mechanism, we pride ourselves on being fast and flexible and responsive, and we manage an in-kind grant-making mechanism, which means that over the past few years, since we started in 2009, we've had probably around 500 discrete activities that have been implemented supporting issues of conflict mitigation and transition in South Sudan. They can take the shape of many different forms. It can be infrastructure, material provision, trainings, dialogues, workshops. We can do animal health. We can bring in anthropologists to advise policymakers. What brings them all together is the fact that they all deal with one of the three main conflict clusters that we've identified, which you can see on the map up there. The red dots represent our activities, and the larger circles represent the areas where we work. And I won't go into the details on each one of those conflict clusters, although I personally find them very interesting. You could talk for hours on them, just for time purposes. But in brief, the one thing they all have in common is that they deal with community security issues that we believe have the ability to influence national level stability. So the one on the top there is dealing with the Sudan and South Sudan border. The one in the middle, the yellow circle, is dealing with the Nuer and Dinka relationships in the middle of the country. We call this the Windlet Triangle. And the one on the right deals with endemic cattle raiding and large-scale instability in the greater Upper Nile region, primarily Jonglei, but also spilling over into Upper Nile. One thing to mention right off the bat is that I'm not a technology expert, and I don't think I really even qualify as a technology and peace-building expert. But in the past 4 years that I've been working on this program in Sudan and South Sudan, an increasing number of our in-kind grants are incorporating elements of technology. And so one thing I can do is maybe give a little bit more of an insight into some of the things that we've tried, the opportunities that we've seen, and also the challenges that we've perceived as we try to roll these activities out in the ground. I'm trying to approach this a little bit structured so that I don't follow any one rabbit down a rabbit hole and start talking about things that I like talking about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 4 design considerations that we use when we do specific messaging, outreach, and dialogue activities within the communities where we work. And then I'm going to give you 4 sample activities and then talk about some of the findings that you can get when you compare across activities looking at the considerations, what we get out of it. The 4 design considerations that I thought were useful to highlight from our context, which is admittedly maybe very different from other people's contexts, considering how remote and underdeveloped South Sudan are, is starting with the access constraints. In the best of times, it's very difficult to work and live in South Sudan. There's very limited infrastructure. Mobile network does not reach across much of the country. Even radio coverage doesn't reach across much of the country. The areas where we work tend to be inaccessible 4 to 8 months out of the year. You can't drive there, you can't even fly there. And so that really limits the type of activities that you can do. It also limits the way that people interact with other communities as well as with their government. But perhaps the most important access constraint up there is security. Because in these communities, insecurity is such that it's impossible for you to travel to the other community or even travel through it to go to the state capital. Many people don't feel secure going to their state capitals or to their national capital at this point, especially with the increase in conflict, because of what it means for their personal security. The second design consideration that I thought worthy of highlighting is the pastoralist lifestyle. According to UN livelihood data, roughly 85% of South Sudanese are in some way, shape, or form dependent on pastoralism as a livelihood. This has significant implications for how people live and how they move, and how they're affected by conflict, because during the war with Sudan, which really only ended in 2005, these pastoralist populations were the ones that were most often mobilized as proxy forces to fight in the conflict, and they remain highly armed and highly militarized. The other component that goes along with that is that within these pastoralist communities, the leadership within the cattle camps is very difficult to work with. We found it very easy to work with civil authorities. We know how to work with town youth. But when it comes to cattle camp youth and cattle camp leaders, we have a very hard time. The next aspects, I'm going slower than I thought I would, as I knew I would. Culture and social structures. This is a design consideration that's important for us as well. These pastoralist groups, they tend to be relatively acephalous, which means that they have devolved decision-making processes that are based more on consensus than on top-down direction, which means that if you want to engage with them, if you want to affect their decisions and the way they interact with each other in their world and their state, it can't be done simply by finding a good leader and then working through him. You actually have to engage the different groups, such as youth and women. And then the final design consideration that I wanted to highlight are the additional communication challenges that are associated with high rates of illiteracy, usually between 80 and 90% in some of the conflict communities, maybe even higher rates of illiteracy, as well as high linguistic diversity and languages that are difficult to, within one state, you can have multiple languages, so it's difficult to reach out to different groups at the same time. All right, so I chose 4 specific projects just to briefly run through them, and then on the last slide, we'll talk about some of the findings when you compare these specific activities and how they interrelate. The first one is the dissemination of migration agreements at the Sudanese border. This is one that we felt, actually let me back up. Out of these 4, the first 2 are not using technology, but I wanted to include them just to give you a perspective of how the inclusion of technology has affected our programming. So the first one is the dissemination of migration agreements at the Sudanese border. This is one that we have felt is particularly effective. Essentially what it is it's part of a larger process of bringing together groups that share natural resources, Sudanese and South Sudanese, and coming up with agreements on how to manage those resources jointly and how to manage a migration of Sudanese into South Sudanese territory. The reason that we feel that this one is very successful is based on 2 factors. The first factor is that there is credible enforcement of any violations of the agreement. The local leaders are supporting this, and also the state government is also supporting this, which means that if there's a transgression, then it can be dealt with in an appropriate way. The other thing that goes along with this is the fact that there's a multicultural, cross-ethnic outreach component. People to people, the Rizagat and the Dinka are coming together, traveling from community to community, and able to give a joint message that inspires trust. And the next one that we have there, women and youth peace rallies in Jonglei, this one shares some characteristics with the first one in the sense that it's people to people and not using technology. What's also similar in this one is that it's multi-ethnic. So we had women in a highly insecure context of spiraling cattle raiding from both communities going around to different, both ethnic groups going around to different communities and giving joint messages of peace. And that was very effective. The communities thought this was very powerful. They'd never met people from that ethnic group before. But the difference between this one and that one, which I wanted to highlight, and this is true for projects with technology and without, is that if there's no credible leadership and no political will to back up the peace, then it doesn't matter. And so it ended up being more of an exercise in persuasion than in education, and in helping people understand what their options were in terms of security and relationships with the others. The third one up there responded to the same conflict that we saw with the peace rallies. This one used film, though. Very low budget, low technology film. There were a lot of leaders that we knew that we could get, that were respected by the youth in these communities, that we thought that we could get to go that were respected by the youth, that we wanted to connect their voices in order to help persuade the youth not to continue on these, not to escalate the cycle of violence associated with the cattle raiding. So using just a local filmmaker, we just got a bunch of 2 to 3 minute interviews of these high-level leaders, made a 1.5-hour film, which was would be very boring to somebody like you or I, but the communities themselves loved it because these are leaders that they never saw. They were coming from the state capital and the national level. And then using a screen out in the middle of the wilderness in the cattle camps and villages, using a solar-powered projector, played these messages. The communities were impressed. They liked the fact that their leaders were reaching out to them. This hadn't happened before. But at the end of the day, they asked us when we did the subsequent interviews, don't tell us this, tell them. They're the ones who are breaking the peace. It's not us. And both sides felt that. So once again, the lack of credible political will and enforcement undermines outreach and engagement mechanisms if you can't address it. The last one is the one that I hope I'm not running out of time too much, because I just wanted to make sure that we do talk about this one, which is an interactive filmmaking project, which was used for sharing stories across conflict lines in the Woodland Triangle, which, if you remember, was the Nuer and Dinka split I mentioned before. This one was a more thoughtful, more time-consuming, and admittedly more expensive process. And it was designed to challenge a narrative of primordial, ancient, and unavoidable conflict between the Nuer and Dinka, which really exploded in 1991 under specific under circumstances similar to the ones that we're seeing right now in South Sudan. We hired an anthropologist who knew the region well. We had a professional filmmaker and special advisors from both communities to travel around and gather interviews from the areas most affected by conflict, to gather stories from elders who could remember what it was like when they used to live together peacefully. We created a film out of this. This was then shown community by community with the same mechanism of putting a sheet up and having a mobile projector. And the screenings were preceded and followed by facilitated discussions that led the communities to discuss whether this narrative had any merit and whether what they thought about it and how they could take it forward. And I know I'm out of time, but just one quick thing was that during the course of this, it was a really, really amazing secondary narrative that came out of it, which was that of intermarriage. And this was something that we didn't see coming in, but it resonated very strongly with the communities. And we discovered that these inter-ethnic couples were actually ambassadors within their own communities that could then be mobilized for future programming, which we're taking forward now. So sorry for taking extra time, but wanted to get through that.
Okay, so I promised the panelists that they would also have a chance to ask questions of each other, but I'd like to start. I think one really interesting thing across all the presentations is the focus on the end user and the local context, as well as peace-building goals, and that the design process really shouldn't stem from the technology itself, but from existing barriers or challenges to peace-building programs, and from a focus on the people who will be using the technology. And so I guess what I'd like to ask is, do you think that there are steps that need to happen in the design process before you even start thinking about technology? I think a lot of times, especially because this is focused on designing programs that do use technology, we're starting from a point of assuming we will use technology. But before you even get to the discussion of if you should use technology and which technology to use, what needs to have already happened in the overall program design? And I don't know if we can start with you, Stephen.
I'll start really quickly.
Okay, great.
And I'll let Henry Ford speak for me. He said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And that's a lot of what needs assessment is. What would you like for us to do? And it immediately starts bounding the universe by what is currently done. And because people have in mind, well, aid or DFID might fund this or that, they're looking for certain justifications for programmatic outcomes. And so that sort of bias is almost inevitable in the questioner. But if there's a certain discipline exercised over the overall process and the sort of questions that are asked, then I think you can ensure more of a really user-centric view, what we would call in the private sector a demand landscape. Let's be solution agnostic and find out where is the real demand, and then we can back into what actual supply solutions might be. It's easy to say, it's hard to do, and involves real discipline on the people exercising that assessment, that they don't let those biases creep in.
I would think of it in terms of the very first thing to do is to define a problem statement. Again, to be agnostic towards solutions and work out what is the problem that you're trying to solve. And with peace-building projects, very often they fall into three broad types. I mean, there are other ones as well. But working on the underlying causes of a conflict, working on the ways in which people are choosing to fight about that conflict rather than resolve it non-violently, and working on the ways in which people, rather than having shared identities across conflict lines and seeing these underlying problems as shared problems, instead they see them as an us versus them problem. And if you use these categories, you're able to work out the kind of problem that you're working on, and then identify what is the activity that enables you to respond to that problem. Very often, the technology will not be the center of that activity. The technology will be a way of making that activity more efficient or at a greater scale or more effective. And then sometimes it is exactly about the tech. And I think going through that process, defining the problem very, very clearly is key before you start thinking about technology.
I love the Henry Ford quote, but I also think that when we first started in Honduras, before I even got there, there seemed to be a real push and an assumption that we were going to use a lot of technology because that's something that has been used in crime reduction throughout the world. So it was jumping in, we're going to use it, and then we got there and really found that that the capacity is really not there, and there's not a lot of it, and the penetration is not there. So we need to reevaluate. So we do have to always fight against that urge to use the newest, sexiest thing that's out there, and be responsive to what is really going to be used in the context that we're in.
I guess there's not a whole lot to add on that, except for maybe two things. One is that looking for the innovation that's bubbling up, that's already there. And then trying to take that forward. I was fascinated to learn that some of the cattle camp youth in Lake State in particular, some of them did have smartphones. Now they didn't have access to mobile networks, but what they could do is they could go into town, and for 1 Sudanese pound, which is about 30 cents, they could buy a song, and for 2 pounds they could buy a movie, and then they bring it back, and they watch movies. And everybody gathers around, and that's that. So that's the potential other way of messaging, is looking at what's already being used, what are the innovations that they're coming up with, let them be the leaders, and then see how you can support that. And then the other one is, I just want to, I guess this is reinforcing what Jim was saying too, which I think is that it's harnessing the strengths and the institutions that are already there, and looking at how the community is already dealing with these problems, and then trying to imagine how you can, what they don't know, what can you connect them to that they can then use for their own purposes.
So it looks like I will break my promise about letting the panelists ask each other questions because we're actually out of time. But we do have a working group tomorrow afternoon, and there's a white paper that you can download. It has questions for the working group at the end, but we're going to focus on 7 different themes that have come up around project design, including how to identify appropriate technology and understanding the limits of technology, as well as risks and ethical implications, and work on generating some questions that can be asked during design processes to help get at some of the underlying issues with each of those themes. So thank you all very much.